On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive joint military offensive against Iran, codenamed Operation Epic Fury on the American side and Operation Roaring Lion on the Israeli side.
The United States military began major combat operations in Iran.
Within hours, explosions rocked Tehran, ballistic missile infrastructure was targeted, nuclear facilities were struck, and the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, was killed. The war that followed shook the entire Middle East, disrupted the global economy, and placed the United States under extraordinary political, military, and economic pressure. But one fundamental question lingers in the corridors of power, in the media, and in the minds of millions of Americans. Why did Donald Trump take America into this war? And more precisely, who truly pushed him into it? The answer, when examined carefully through the lens of events, intelligence briefings, diplomatic failures, and the testimony of world leaders, points unmistakably toward one direction: Israel, and specifically Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli blueprint for war. The road to the 2026 war did not begin in February. It began years earlier with a systematic Israeli campaign to draw the United States into a direct military confrontation with Iran. In the lead-up to his strikes, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu lobbied President Donald Trump for a joint military strike on Iran, specifically targeting its leadership. Following high-level meetings in February, Trump authorized Operation Epic Fury, with reports citing Israeli intelligence provided by Netanyahu as a decisive factor in the decision. This is not incidental, it is foundational. The intelligence that Trump relied upon to justify the war was provided by the very country that stood to gain the most from Iran's destruction. Senator Mark Warner of the Senate Intelligence Committee, who was briefed by Secretary of State Rubio before the war began, said that there was no evidence that Iran was going to launch a preemptive strike against the US and that the war was ultimately decided upon by Israel. This is a damning statement. The very premise upon which Trump justified the war, an imminent Iranian threat, was, according to the Senate's own intelligence apparatus, largely a fabrication constructed to serve Israeli strategic interests. Oman's foreign minister and lead mediator, Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi, commented after the outbreak of hostilities in March 2026 that negotiations over the nuclear program had been making progress, and that the US-Israeli war against Iran was solely an attempt to reorder the Middle East in Israel's favor. In a March 2026 opinion piece for The Economist, Badr al-Busaidi claimed the United States had lost control of its own foreign policy and accused Israel of persuading the Trump administration to engage in a war with Iran, which he termed a grave miscalculation and a catastrophe. Coming from the very mediator who had been conducting the nuclear talks on behalf of Oman, this is perhaps the most authoritative external verdict on who truly engineered this war.
Netanyahu's personal and political motivations. Israel's motivations were not purely strategic. Netanyahu himself was facing severe political and legal pressures. Netanyahu has faced charges for corruption, and the war may have helped him avoid dealing with these. The war may also help the Israeli government to overhaul Israel's Supreme Court, mitigate criticism of Israel's treatment of Palestinians, and help Netanyahu with the 2026 Israeli legislative election. This is the crucial backdrop that is often ignored in mainstream narratives. A leader facing corruption charges, political erosion, and international isolation over Gaza does not simply stumble into a war with Iran. He engineers one, and finds a willing partner in Donald Trump, whose own administration was ideologically aligned with Israel's security vision and politically dependent on evangelical and pro-Israel donor networks. Throughout the war, Israeli strategy reflected the aim of eliminating Iran as a rival regional power. Israeli strikes targeted Iran's political elites broadly across differing factions, undermining the possibility of regime change, while Israeli officials and intelligence agencies also incited and backed ethnic separatist causes, threatening Iran's internal stability. The Saudi factor and the lobbying network. It was not Netanyahu alone who whispered in Trump's ear. According to the Washington Post, Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia Mohammed bin Salman urged Trump to attack Iran in multiple phone calls, and that the Saudi Arabian and Israeli governments lobbied Trump repeatedly to make the move in the weeks leading up to the initial strikes. It has also been reported that Saudi Arabia pushed Trump to continue the war against Iran until its government is overthrown. A Gulf diplomat alleged that U.S. intermediaries Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were acting in Israeli interests to pressure the United States into a military confrontation. When the president's own inner circle, his son-in-law among them, is being accused of serving a foreign government's agenda, it raises profound questions about the independence of American foreign policy decision-making. Trump's own contradictions, a war without a clear rationale. One of the most telling signs that this war lacked genuine American strategic grounding is the contradictory nature of the justifications offered for it. The Trump administration gave various explanations for starting the war, including forestalling Iranian retaliation after an expected Israeli attack, destroying Iran's missile capabilities, preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon, seizing Iran's oil resources and gas resources, or achieving regime change. No coherent, unified rationale ever emerged. On April 2nd, U.S. President Trump stated he does not care about Iran's stock of highly enriched uranium, HEU, as it is underground, contradicting a key rationale he brought up when starting the war. In fact, Iran's HEU stock is now assessed as a more risky scenario than before the war began, as it would leave Iran significantly closer to the capability of making nuclear bombs than the proposed settlement being negotiated in Geneva 2 days before the war began. This extraordinary admission that the primary justification for war was something Trump himself now doesn't care about reveals the hollow core of the American case. The nuclear threat was a pretext. The real agenda was Israel's regional dominance. America under crushing pressure. The consequences for the United States have been severe. The war has placed America under levels of economic, military, and political strain not seen since the Iraq War of 2003. On May 12th, the cost of the war to the U.S. military was estimated at nearly $200 billion. At a time when Americans are struggling with inflation, healthcare costs, and economic uncertainty, a war costing hundreds of billions of dollars for a conflict of uncertain strategic benefit is politically toxic. The war is inflicting significant economic damage on the U.S. economy, including in the forms of rising energy prices, inflation, and military costs. Oil prices surged dramatically following the outbreak of hostilities. Prices surged from about $103 per barrel in March. The hostilities have severely disrupted global energy supply, intensified inflationary pressures, and posed a direct shock to global shipping as well as the economies of Gulf countries, Trends Research and Advisory. Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil passes, caused a global supply shock unlike anything seen in decades. The 2026 Iran war disrupted global travel and trade, halted flights in and out of the Middle East, and led to shipping reroutes to avoid the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. Dubai International Airport, one of the world's busiest, was struck by Iranian drones and temporarily shut down. U.S. allies across the region were caught in the crossfire. Domestically, the political damage for Trump has been real and deep. The conflict has increased the Democratic Party's chances of making political gains in the 2026 midterm elections and exposed divisions among MAGA and non-MAGA Republicans. Led by Tucker Carlson, some MAGA supporters regarded going to war against Iran as antithetical to MAGA's core beliefs. Some critics of the war charged that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had persuaded Trump to start a war that served Israel's interests more than America's. Brookings. Another report produced for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff by the Joint Chiefs Intelligence Directorate found that the war with Iran is working to China's advantage across military, economic, and diplomatic domains. Brookings. America's greatest rival is emerging stronger from a war that America chose to fight on behalf of its ally.
The fracturing of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Perhaps the most ironic consequence of Trump's decision to go to war for Israel is that it has severely strained the very relationship it was meant to strengthen. The ceasefire announcement on April 8, 2026, immediately exposed the fault lines. After the United States and Iran announced their ceasefire in early April, there was disagreement among the parties on whether Lebanon was included. Just hours after the announcement, the IDF conducted a blitz across Lebanon that killed hundreds of people and wounded more than 1,000 others, straining the ceasefire between the United States and Iran. Encyclopedia Britannica. Israel's brazen disregard for a ceasefire that the United States had painstakingly negotiated placed Washington in an impossible position, caught between its obligations to the ceasefire and its alliance with Israel. Iran has insisted that any deal to end the war must also end fighting between its ally Hezbollah and Israel. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appears intent on pursuing his goal of destroying the militant group. NPR. Responding to widespread criticism from Israel, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance called for Israeli support and stated, "Trump is your only ally left in world." Wikipedia. That such a statement needed to be made publicly is itself a measure of how far the relationship had deteriorated. An ally that must be publicly reminded of its dependence is an ally that is pushing back. On June 13th, Israel launched large-scale attacks targeting Iran's military leadership and nuclear scientists. Consequently, Iran withdrew and suspended nuclear talks indefinitely. Wikipedia. Every time US diplomats made progress in negotiations with Iran, Israel launched strikes that collapsed those efforts. America's foreign policy was repeatedly hostage to Netanyahu's military agenda. The diplomatic cost: a world turning away. America's international standing has taken a significant hit. The United Nations Secretary General condemned the strikes. Spain, a NATO ally, refused to allow the US to use its air bases. Spain, a NATO member that had already squabbled with US demands during the second Trump administration, refused to allow the United States to use its air bases, leading Trump to threaten to cut trade with the country. Encyclopedia Britannica. The image of the United States threatening trade sanctions against a European NATO ally because that ally refused to participate in a war of choice in the Middle East is a measure of how isolated Washington has become. America did not enter this war as the leader of a coalition. It entered it dragged by one small but powerful ally. Conclusion: a war made in Tel Aviv, fought in Washington. The 2026 war with Iran is, at its core, a war that Israel needed and America was persuaded to fight. The evidence is overwhelming. It was Israeli intelligence that shaped Trump's decision. It was Netanyahu who lobbied in person for the strikes. It was Israeli intermediaries embedded within Trump's own inner circle who pushed the administration toward conflict. And it was Israel's refusal to honor the ceasefire that repeatedly sabotaged American diplomacy. Trump entered this war wrapped in the language of American security: nuclear threats, imminent danger, protecting US bases. But those justifications collapsed one by one under scrutiny. Critics, including legal and international relations experts, described the US attacks as illegal under US law, an act of imperialism and a violation of Iran's sovereignty. Wikipedia. The United States is now paying the price: billions in military expenditure, spiking oil prices, domestic political fractures, a strained alliance with Israel, and a global reputation in decline. The war was Israel's war. America simply fought it, and is now left to bear the consequences alone.